Thank you so much, Dan. Our next speaker quite literally needs no introduction, so I will spend only 15 seconds on it. Mayor Michael Bloomberg, it's an honor for me to introduce the mayor. Mayor Michael Bloomberg has been a unique and visionary leader on energy and climate change, a forceful voice reminding us about the need to take urgent action to deal with climate change and the risk it poses. Also a voice of balance and pragmatism on our broader energy mix, for example, on issues associated with domestic natural gas production. As part of the Hurricane Sandy team in the White House, even while I was on the ground here in New York because I couldn't get back, the mayor and his team were on top of the situation throughout, leaving no stone unturned to help this city get back up and running, and are still working tirelessly to make sure that we're more resilient in the future. And just on a personal note, I'll say I grew up in New York. I left here in 2000, just before Mayor Bloomberg took office. I moved back here a few months ago. And sometimes you can appreciate change a bit better when you don't live through it, but when you see it in before and after snapshots. And I can just say that the changes are really extraordinary. The city is cleaner and greener and safer, more livable, and there's even a professional sports team in my home borough of Brooklyn. So as a newly returned resident of the city, I just want to express my gratitude to Mayor Bloomberg for all that he's done over the last 11 years. I know many of us hope that he'll continue to find ways to serve in public life in the future. Please join me in welcoming to Columbia Mayor Michael Bloomberg.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. For those of you from out of town, welcome to New York. I ask just one thing, that while you're here, you spend a lot of money. We need the sales tax revenues. Anyways, Jason, congratulations on the launch of this exciting new Center of Global Energy Policy, and I have to say, you've got it exactly right. You've got some people here blinded by the sun, which is heating them, and the people over here are just much more energy efficient. I don't know what, they're not sweating as much, and I don't know why sweat changes your energy, but whatever it does. Anyways, I think there's no better home for the center than right here in New York City. I mean, talk about global, we are, I have to brag, but I have to. We are the most global city. Every language on earth is spoken here on the sidewalks of New York. When you go outside, for those of you from outside of New York, just take a look at the people that you pass on the street, because 40% of them will have been born outside of the United States. Not their parents or grandparents. When we talk about immigrants, we talk about people who literally were born, in many cases raised overseas. And every day, half of the equity traded in the world flows through our exchanges, our culture, our communications, our commerce. We are a global hub. And you wonder where I'm going with this? Well, then we get to energy. I think that it's fair to say New York defines high energy. We will always have it that way. Ed Koch once said, this is where the future comes to audition, and it's certainly true when it comes to energy. Finally got to the energy you were waiting for. 200 years ago, steam power made its mark here with Robert Fulton's famous steamboat and with the steamships and railroads that powered New York's meteoric economic rise. And at the turn of the last century, New York is where Thomas Edison's electric generators and electric lights first revolutionized how we work and live. And I remember my mother telling me, hi Lee, how are you? Thank you for having me. My mother telling me she remembers, she grew up in Jersey City, and she remembers when electricity came in to her house, they got rid of the gas lights, and she was born in '09, so it wasn't that long ago that everything we take for granted was not there. In my mother's lifetime, the Wright brothers were slightly before she was born, but she took the Concorde back and forth. She had a cell phone. She had a PC. Obviously, all of the other accoutrements that we have added. The world is changing at a very rapid rate, and what was true in the days of Fulton and Edison, I think, really remained true today. New York is where the energy future is taking shape. New York is at the dawn of a new age of innovation in energy. In fact, many of the key national questions of the day are unfolding right here, including the future of nuclear power, the responsible development and delivery of shale gas, the phase out of coal-fueled power generation, innovations in energy efficiency financing, and the wider use of renewable resources of power in dense urban environments like ours. And Columbia University will play a big part in this era of innovation. Columbia's major new Institute for Data Science and Engineering, an institute the city is partnering with Columbia to create, will include a Smart Cities Center. It will focus on such vital energy questions as creating green infrastructure and smart power grid technology. And now Columbia's new Center on Global Energy Policy will also tackle some of the most difficult international energy and environmental policy issues, particularly ones that lack simple solutions. There is no magic bullet that will solve all our energy challenges, and I've always believed that rigorous analysis is key to understanding the fundamental trade-offs, because nothing comes free, and that certainly includes energy emissions, reliability, economic development, markets designed to encourage private financing, and how best to use scarce ratepayer and taxpayer revenues. Today, public dialogue over the future of energy really is badly skewed towards the extremes, and I think that does little to advance the public interest. And Jason, I hope that this center will change that. We need to get serious, and we need to have some discussions that don't involve political ideology and that don't involve just people pandering to a particular base. We have to get serious about facing the competing security, economic, and environmental trade-offs that a realistic, forward-thinking energy policy requires. And we have to be willing to take bold action, locally and nationally, to ensure a sustainable energy future for all of this. I'm going to touch briefly, if I can, on a handful of things that I believe have to be at the top of our to-do list of energy policy actions. But let me repeat, I think one of the real impediments to this country and to this world to have a sensible energy policy really has little to do with energy. It has all to do with political pandering to various groups, whether they're groups that support a candidate or groups that vote for or against a candidate. And when you start looking at things like fracking or nuclear power plants in the context of is it good or bad politics, then we can't come up with an intelligent design. No matter what you think about fracking or nuclear policy, you have to have something that's done on real science and a real assessment of the benefits and the risk. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is encouraging environmentally responsible use of America's newly accessible and abundant supplies of natural gas. The advances in fracking and horizontal drilling technology really have produced this natural gas bonanza that there's nobody 5 years ago had predicted whatsoever, and it's just lowered power prices much more so than anybody had ever expected, and it's also helped cut America's carbon emissions to levels not seen in the last 20 years. Natural gas has the potential to benefit us for decades to come, but I think it's fair to say only if the drilling is done right in a fashion that protects the environment. And that's why I've partnered with fracking pioneer George Mitchell and the Environmental Defense Fund to develop and strongly advocate for the adoption of sensible regulatory safeguards. And it is why we'll continue to urge holdouts in the natural gas industry to stop resisting such measures, because I do think that history shows that when industries attempt to block sound regulation, they really don't help their own cause. Instead, they set themselves up for disasters caused by the worst rogue players. And responsible leaders in the natural gas industry certainly know that we need sound regulations, and we need it now. The stakes could not be higher. Low natural gas prices have been the key to reducing New York City's greenhouse gas emissions by 16% over the past 5 years. We know today that more than 50% of the natural gas powering New York City comes from shale gas, and we can expect that to grow to 90% by 2020. And whether that gas is extracted in New York State or not, we need to have some sensible, tough, and comprehensive regulatory scheme in place right now. I'm fascinated by people who go on and worry about the potential dangers of fracking, which clearly are there and have to be investigated and have to be regulated to make sure that we don't do any damage. But while we're having that discussion, just remember that 13,000 Americans will die from the effects of coal-fired power plant pollution every year. I don't know of anybody yet that's been killed by fracking. I'm not here to promote fracking. I think we should do it, but I think we have to have certain regulations, and I've always been opposed to doing it in the watershed. But these things have to be looked in the context of what are the alternatives. We're not going back into the caves without electricity and cooking our meals over a few logs. We are going to use energy. And the bottom line is that wind and solar are great, but they just do not have the potential at the moment to become the main source of energy in our country. And so we've got to make a decision here. Nuclear, the same thing. We have pressure here to close Indian Point, which is the local, 100 miles away nuclear plant. That's great, but what are the alternatives? Where are we going to get energy from? And is that more dangerous or doing more damage? Unfortunately, it's easy to pander and say you picture a nuclear explosion or fracking. I love the word because it connotes something bad. It's just, you listen to this, too many consonants in the word fracking, hard consonants. That's unfortunately the basis on which some of our regulation and the pandering is done. Another thing we need is state and national policies that support renewable power. At this point, let me make something clear. Natural gas and renewables should be seen as energy allies, certainly not as energy antagonists. Any transition to renewable energy as the dominant source of electricity is going to take some time. I think it's way, way down in the future, and natural gas certainly is something that is going to have to help fill the gap, and one that clearly is far better for our planet and our lungs than the coal and oil that is replaced. I understand that natural gas is a fossil fuel. I understand that it is not perfectly clean, but when you compare it to the fact that coal generates roughly 1/3 of our entire greenhouse gases in this country, you sit there and you say, wait a second, you got to have an order of magnitude test here and see what you should be focusing on. Consider this, most of the locally generated soot pollution in New York City comes from buildings that still burn heavy oil fuel. We are very different than other cities. Most cities, 80% of the pollution comes from transportation, 20% from buildings, but because we live very densely, because we walk a lot, and because we take mass transit, it's exactly the reverse in New York City. We get 80% of our pollution from buildings. And the good news is we don't have to worry about federal laws preventing us from forcing people to switch from number 6 and number 4 fuel down to number 2, oil or natural gas. And we're doing that, and that's one of the reasons why New York City is making much better progress, I think, than other cities in reducing the amount of carbon we put into the air. We've changed the rules to phase out the most polluting forms of heating oil. We've been innovative in trying to have programs where encouraging banks to make loans to landlords so that they can go and make the change. The fact that natural gas is a lot cheaper gives them an economic incentive to do so. I personally gave a lot of money to the Sierra Club to help close coal-fired plants across the country, but it's natural gas really that has been the big driver to get close coal-fired plants. And the same thing is true in getting people to convert in their buildings right here in New York City. We've also created a groundbreaking public-private partnership called Clean Heat, and that's something that helps building owners accelerate the financing to financing to go to cleaner fuels. And it's already produced more than 1,500 conversions in just 2 years and cut by more than 25% the amount of soot produced by using heavy fuel oil. But unfortunately, there's not enough gas pipeline capacity in our city for all building owners to switch to natural gas, even if they wanted to. And that's why we've been out there lobbying strongly for the siting of the Spectra and Williams-Rockaways pipelines, which would be the first new interstate gas pipelines to directly serve our city in decades. There's a lot of objections to the pipelines. This is New York. There's objections to everything. But in the meantime, if you live here, you're breathing that air. If your children are living here, they're growing up with that air in their lungs. And maybe people want to stop and say, wait a second, I'm tired of listening to some special interests that didn't want the pipeline to go under their property or whatever. or it may be damaging in some other ways. We have a crisis. People are really dying from the effects of pollution. And you can talk about long-term climate change, and my eyes glaze over, because while I am a believer that something's happening to our atmosphere and our planet, and I think it probably is something much more serious than just a short-term thing, the real answer, however, is right now, today. You, me, our children are breathing this air. You, me, and our children are fighting the effects of congestion. You, me, and our children have our opportunities reduced because we haven't addressed a lot of these things. And I've always thought that if we focus on the short term, rather than the long-term effects on the planet, you will get to the same place, but you'll get to it without an awful lot of the naysayers, and you'll get there without an awful lot of the delays that people can put in. We actually have maps that we built that look at where kids who live in New York City who have asthma come from when they go to the hospital with an asthma attack. And if you plot it, you'll see the main roads right through New York. People that live near the main roads, the air is dirtier because of the trucks that go through our city, and because the air is dirtier, their asthma attacks are worse. I think it's true that our renewables, before our renewables will achieve full potential, there has to be a price put on carbon emissions from all fossil fuels, including natural gas, either in the form of a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade regime. Otherwise, renewables will never compete on a level playing field. That is going to require federal action, and in case you hadn't been reading the newspapers, getting anything sensible done in Washington, particularly that saves lives, is something that looks like it's very difficult to do. 12,000 Americans this year will get killed with guns, 19,000 will commit suicide with guns, and our Congress can't vote to stop the carnage. So if they can't do that, they're not about to do something to help things like, oh, I don't believe that you really get sick from breathing this stuff in the air. Nevertheless, we have to somehow or other mobilize ourselves and tell Congress we're not going to put up with it anymore, because unless you do that, you're not going to have a sensible energy policy. It's something that states can't do on their own. We really do have to have a federal regulations. It happens that there are just a whole bunch of important renewable energy projects that still remain on the drawing board, and I'm not so sure it's because they have trouble getting financing. I think it's more the impact when the rubber meets the road with the local legislators and with federal policy that's stopping them from going ahead. There is, however, plenty that I think we can do, and it is being done at the local level, including New York. I've always thought that in this country, and maybe even around the world, it is the cities that are making the progress in reducing crime and improving education and in improving our environment. At the state level, or whatever is similar to state level around the world, and at the federal level, that's where the blockage to doing anything always seems to be. But take a look at what we can do. In solar power, our administration has fostered a 10-fold increase in the solar capacity in the city over the past 6 years. We're also working with the New York State Power Authority and Con Ed, our local provider, transmitter, actually they don't generate anymore, on development of offshore wind power, and with another utility, National Grid, to transform waste gas from the largest wastewater treatment plant in the city into marketable and renewable natural gas. One of the first projects of its kind. And we're moving ahead on all of these fronts. And I was flying into New York the other day, and it struck me when you look out the window about, Kaz, how long ago was, where are you? How long ago was I was on the roof with Al Gore painting roofs white? 5 years? 4 or 5 years ago. It was a big joke. Everybody laughed about it. The papers made fun of it. When I flew in, my guess would be 80% of the roofs in New York City that are flat are now painted white. Paint your roof white, fundamentally reduce your energy consumption by 25%, which reduces the amount of carbon put into the air by 25%. So you really can do some of these things, but once again, it's a local thing where you've done it because it's in the interest of each of the individual building owners in this case to do it. And if you can work at that level, then I think you can avoid most of the political problems and get things done. We're moving ahead on lots of fronts. but there is only so much we can do. We need the right incentives. We need local and national policies, as I've said, to make renewable energy a meaningful part of our city and the nation's energy mix. So I think that renewables, like this Center on Global Energy Policy is focusing on, will really give us a lot of potential. The third and final issue I want to address this morning is climate change and resilience, and that's specifically confronting the risks that climate change poses to the security of our energy supply and our energy infrastructure. I think Hurricane Sandy here in New York offered dramatic evidence of why it's so vital. At the worst point, some 630,000 electric customers in our area, more than 1.5 million people were without power over the storm. After the storm, unfortunately, the highest record we'd ever had for a surge was 9 feet or something like that. Con Ed built a 12-foot wall around one of their transformer plants. The bad news was we got 14 feet of water, and so that took out one thing, but hopefully that will not happen again. Nevertheless, we saw a lot of buildings that had never occurred to them that there would be a flood. I visited some buildings down on the South Street Seaport, which is down the Lower East Side, and one was some kind of a store, I forget what, and the owner was showing me the watermark on the wall where the water had gotten to, and I jumped and I could not touch the watermark. So, you know, they had 10 feet of water, and this building is a couple feet above the ground level, which is a few feet above mean high tide. And I said to him something about, well, it's going to take a while, and we've got a program to help you get a new electric panel, a new hot water heater, and new space heaters in. And he said, oh, we don't have any problems with that stuff. That's all upstairs. And I said, why didn't you put it in the basement? He said, well, this building was built 150 years ago, and they didn't put basements in buildings built 150 years ago when they built them right by the water because they thought there might be floods. Literally a block away, a whole big group of very big office buildings, one of which I worked in for 10 years, had their whole basements and all their infrastructure flooded out, and the telephone companies had virtually all of their infrastructure downtown destroyed. We also found that we had a severe gasoline shortage here. When Jason, you saw firsthand when Sandy stranded you here in New York City, the storm severely damaged or shut down our entire energy supply from the pipelines like the Buckeye pipeline that brings fuel here to hundreds of service stations that would have had to pump the gas. They didn't have the electricity to do it. The port was closed thanks to some federal regulations on the Coast Guard, and people started panicking, and then of course you had your usual cycle of everybody trying to fill their tank all the time and long lines, and it became a cause célèbre for every local official that said, we're going to have to make sure that every gas station has a backup generator. Problem wasn't backup generator, they didn't have any gas. But nobody's going to, that's a whole separate problem, so nobody wanted to get involved in that. The process to restore all this was painfully slow. And Jason, I want to thank you and two of the speakers here today, U.S. Deputy Energy Secretary Daniel Baumann and also Dan Yergin, who really needs no introduction to this crowd because they really did work closely with our administrative team to restore the fuel supply chain feeding New York City after Sandy. But Sandy did make it critically clear to us that energy networks are more vulnerable than we can afford to have them. And in a few weeks, our administration has promised to deliver, and we will, a full report on our plans to make our city, including our energy infrastructure, more resilient to major coastal storms and especially weather events in the city. And those plans include working with our principal utility, Con Ed, to increase their system's reliability and reduce storm damage, and also with our telephone companies. We've become so dependent on the phone. After all, if your phone doesn't work, you can't Twitter, and God forbid you can't Twitter, or Facebook, whatever that is. And you know, you can laugh all you want, but that was a great calamity, and all of the cell towers have batteries that last 8 or 16 hours, and of course then they stop working, and the fact that you couldn't communicate became a very big issue. A cynic might say that we did just fine back in the olden days, but that reminds me of the cartoon that I have at home where the two cavemen are sitting in the cave, and one says to the other, "I just don't get it. We drink clean water, we breathe pure air, all our food is organic, we get plenty of exercise, and we die at age 25. Hopefully we will move on from that. Better living through chemistry, thank you. Nationally, as well as locally, we need to move to the 21st century regulation of utilities and incentivize development of distributed energy and microgrids and energy storage and other technologies. Now, none of these are new ideas, but thanks to Sandy, perhaps they will have a new urgency. At least I hope so. But on the other hand, after Sandy Hook, we couldn't get the Senate to pass sensible gun regulations. So I don't know what it takes. We have a battle here going of people who want to stay with their homes right on the beach. One person who works for us, her family has had a house in Breezy Point, which is one of these barrier islands off the coast. They've been flooded out 7 times since the 1930s. And every time they have rebuilt. And you say, well, do you want to move now? Of course not. This is where people want to live. And so we're going to have to deal with the fact that people are going to want to live on the beach. They're not going to want to raise their houses, or they're certainly not going to do it unless they absolutely have to down the road. And we're going to have similar kinds of problems that we did, where we had something like 20,000 houses that had no electricity, but worse, their electric panel was destroyed, no heat and hot water. Their water heaters and their space heaters were destroyed, and Kaz Holloway put together a group of 8 contractors from around the country. They created teams. In 2 months, we gave a new hot water heater, new space heater, and a new electric panel to 20,000 housing units. I don't think anybody has ever done anything remotely like that. But where did we put all of the equipment? Well, we put it in the basement, where the next flood will do exactly the same thing, and the reason for that is there's just no space above ground, and people, on one hand, complain about the effects of hurricanes. On the other hand, they don't want to make the necessary compromises to ensure their safety and reliability down the road, and we're going to have to figure out some ways to balance those two things. I don't think there could be a better time for the creation of this new global center, and I hope it will take up the challenges that rising sea levels and intensifying ocean storms pose here and in cities around the world. We had a terrible tragedy here with Hurricane Sandy. There were 40-odd people that died. But if you put it in perspective, something like 1,800 people died in New Orleans in Katrina. And there have been tsunamis and floods and places where 200,000 people died in any one situation. This is something that really around the world is a very big problem. From the beginning of time, we've chosen to live near the water. That's where the food supply used to come from. That's where everybody's dream is to live. It's a desirable place, but it also means that our populations are going to be more in danger than ever before. And it's going to take the kind of ingenuity and enterprise that the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman has recently written about to make energy and resource efficiency what he calls the next great global industry. And to spur and complement that industry, we're also going to need effective and pragmatic energy solutions in natural gas use and encouraging renewable power and in achieving energy resilience. This will require independence, rigorous and data-driven analysis, and advocacy. And that's where all of you come in, because you presumably, the fact that you're here, care, and one can only hope you know what you're doing. Because my future and my kids' future is dependent on you. I know that's something that's going to really keep you up late tonight worried about it, but it is precisely, all kidding aside, what we can expect and looking forward from this new Center on Global Energy Policy. So I'm delighted to be here and help you launch this effort today, and I look forward to working with you in years to come. I will be unemployed in 251 days. I work for $1 a year. If anybody's got a job, give me a buzz. Thank you.